I've been following the debate over how the Smithsonian tells the American story with great interest over the last few weeks. On July 4th, the White House released a report on the Smithsonian called Saving America's Story. The report claims that the museum has explicitly adopted an ideological framework that no longer treats the American story as a shared national inheritance to be taught or celebrated, but as a political instrument to divide, dispirit, and discourage our citizens. Later, the report goes even further. It says, as it stands today, it would benefit most Americans, especially parents bringing their children for a tour, if the Smithsonian's flagship history museum had a label at every entrance that read, "Warning, the exhibits in this museum were prepared by people who don't want you to love your country." In response, Smithsonian Secretary Lonnie Bunch III wrote to his staff, "At the Smithsonian, our work is driven by scholarship, accuracy, and an uncompromising commitment to the fullness of the American story." Clearly, how a nation tells its story matters. One of the clearest examples of this in recent memory was the New York Times 1619 Project. Both celebrated and fiercely criticized, it asks Americans to reconsider the nation's founding by placing the arrival of enslaved Africans at 1619 at the center of the story, rather than beginning at the Declaration of Independence in 1776. It was therefore no surprise that back then, when the 1619 Project came out, President Donald Trump established a competing 1776 commission to tell the nation's story differently. At first glance, these look like arguments over historical facts. But listen carefully and you'll hear something else. Beneath the disagreements lie a deeper question. What is history for? This morning, I want to suggest that we're having this debate in our country so fiercely because we're not actually talking about history at all. What we're talking about is memory. History and memory, they serve different purposes. History asks what happened, and memory asks what those events mean and how they should shape us. History preserves the past. Memory carries the past into the present. The facts of history matter, but facts alone don't tell a people what they ought to become. Every society must decide how it will allow its history to shape its future. And this is a deeply Jewish way of thinking. Our tradition has never treated memory as an archive. It's treated memory as a teacher. The late Jewish historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi wrote one of his most influential books on Jewish history. Surprisingly, he didn't call the book history, he called it Zachor, remember, or memory. A historian who believed that memory mattered maybe even more than history. Yerushalmi argues that modern Jews know more Jewish history than ever before. And yet, all that scholarship has done, it's done so much, but surprisingly very little to shape Jewish memory. Yerushalmi argues that Judaism has traditionally preserved its past primarily through books of history. And not through books of history, but through rituals, stories, and symbols that invite every generation to see itself as part of the story. His work suggests that Judaism has never sought to simply remember the past, but to let memory shape the next generation. And that distinction between history and memory becomes the key understanding to help us think about one of the strangest parts of Torah. This week, we began our final book of the Torah, the book of Devarim. We find Moses in the final year of his life, and the Israelites in the final year of their journey. Moses knows what we all know, that he will not accompany the Israelites into their promised land. His journey, like all of our journeys, will end on the way. Standing on the far bank of the Jordan River, Moses begins to give a farewell address to his people. His speech ranges from travel stories to warnings to encouragement. But it begins by looking back over the 40 years that they've shared together. One story in particular deserves our attention. Moses retells the story of the 12 spies. Then all of you came to me, he said, and you said, let us send agents ahead to scout the land for us and bring back word on the route we shall follow and the cities we shall come to. I approved the plan, and so I selected 12 of you, one representative from each tribe. At first, this sounds like an ordinary retelling of one of Israel's defining moments, but now something has changed. This version that Moses tells, it's not the version of the story that we read in the book of Numbers. In Numbers, it's God who commands Moses to send scouts into the land. In Numbers, the emphasis falls on God's command of Moses and of Israel. Here, Moses emphasizes that it's the people's idea. Why at this very moment, as he's preparing the next generation to enter the land, does Moses retell one of Israel's defining stories in this different way? The medieval commentator Abarbanel suggests that Moses has left out some details of the original story because he is now telling a story of memory. As Abarbanel explains, Moses is speaking to the second generation. And he writes, if they heard the truth of the incident as it happened, they would say that the reason for the delay in the desert was not themselves, but God. Most medieval commentators see two stories in the Torah that don't fit together exactly, and they try to find ways, elegant or sometimes not so elegant, to harmonize them into a single story. Abarbanel reads differently. And read through Yerushalmi's distinction between history and memory, Abarbanel's insight becomes even more striking. Moses is not simply recounting the past, he's interpreting it for people who must live its consequences. He wants them to have courage as they enter the promised land. He wants them to stay faithful to their God. As he talks to the next generation, the ones that will actually enter the land of Israel, he emphasizes their culpability in the incident of the spies. Instead of focusing on God's commanding, Moses focuses on the intense interests of the Israelites. That they wanted the spies to go forward, and that they so easily believed the bad report of the 10 spies. Moses is worried that if he frames the story in the way that it's told in Numbers, that the Israelites will focus on blaming Moses for instructing the spies, and even blaming God for sending them. And in this focus on blame, they'll lose touch with their own responsibility. They'll be shaped by this moment, and it won't change them for good. What are we meant to make of Moses' role as reteller? If he's framing the story for the next generation, is he not being a fair arbiter of the past? Is he neglecting his responsibility for the people in telling this story in a new way? I don't think so. Because the task of a leader is not simply to preserve a community's memories. It's to help a community remember in ways that cultivate responsibility, courage, and faithfulness. Moses isn't changing the story. He's framing it so that this generation will hear the lessons that they need to hear. This is the work of crafting memory, and it's always been one of Judaism's greatest strengths. The rabbis, they inherited Moses' way of remembering. One of the clearest examples comes this week as we observe Tisha B'Av. The Mishnah teaches that 5 calamities for the Jewish people all occurred on the 9th of Av. This bad report of the spies in the Torah happened on the 9th of Av. The destruction of the first and second temple, and the flattening of Jerusalem so that it could never be rebuilt. All on the same day, in different years, Tisha B'Av. Is it true that they all happened on the 9th of Av? Even if they did, that's not really where the Mishnah's power lies. The rabbis are trying to show us that our grief, it comes in cycles. That each generation of Jews has had their own moments of tragedy and destruction, but that it's our responsibility to understand that they're all connected, that we must cry for them all. A historian would demand verifiable data to confirm each of these dates. And this would be important information to know if it could be discovered. But if the exact dates were discovered, would it really change the fundamental insight of how we understand these events as connected? The history may be altered, but the memory would stay the same. Judaism insists that history, it's never enough. We must also ask what the memories demand of us today. On Passover, we celebrate a redemption that we did not experience directly. And on Tisha B'Av, we cry for a temple that we never saw. Judaism asks us to encounter these events, not through the distance of history, but through the intimacy of memory. Spend less time learning about the people who lived through these events and more time finding ways to enter their emotional world. Because we use these events to shape our present, to become a more thoughtful, a more grounded, a richer community. Perhaps we might make different decisions in the future than they made in the past. Listen closely to the debates over the 1619 Project or the Smithsonian, and you'll notice something. People spend surprisingly little time arguing over individual facts. They spend far more time arguing over what those facts tell us to do. They worry about how these presentations might inspire us to act. And it makes sense because collective memory is very, very powerful. So no wonder these debates have become so passionate. No one argues this fiercely over the footnotes of a history book. We argue because we know that the stories a nation tells itself shape the kind of nation it becomes. We're arguing over collective memory. This is why Americans care so deeply about whether slavery stands at the center of our national story or whether the revolution does. It's why people care so deeply about what's emphasized in a museum exhibit or omitted from it. Because these debates, they're not just about facts. They're about what kinds of citizens those facts are meant to produce. Standing on the banks of the Jordan, Moses understands that the future of the Jewish people would depend not only on what they knew, but on what they chose to remember. Every year when we gather at a Seder table, when we sit on the floor on Tisha B'Av, when we retell our stories again and again, we make that same choice. We don't remember simply to preserve the past. We remember so that the past might shape the people that we have become and are still becoming. Shabbat Shalom.